By April 1945, Berlin was collapsing. Soviet forces were closing in from every direction, artillery shaking the city day and night. The Third Reich, which had once dominated most of Europe, was reduced to a shrinking defensive perimeter around the capital. Adolf Hitler had withdrawn underground into the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, where he remained surrounded by senior officials, military staff, and personal aides. Inside the bunker, the military situation was clear. German counterattacks had failed. Communications were breaking down. Units that existed on paper no longer existed in reality. Reports reaching Hitler confirmed that Soviet troops were now fighting street by street only blocks away. On April 29th, with defeat unavoidable, Hitler carried out one final personal decision. He married Eva Braun, his longtime companion, during a small ceremony inside the bunker. Later that day, he finalized his political testament and dictated instructions regarding the handling of his body after death. He stated that he did not intend to be captured alive. The following afternoon, April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Braun withdrew to their private quarters. Shortly afterward, aides outside the room heard a gunshot. When staff entered, they found both dead. The most widely accepted historical account concludes that Hitler committed suicide by shooting himself in the head while also ingesting cyanide. Eva Braun died beside him after taking poison. Hitler was 56 years old. Following his instructions, bunker personnel wrapped the bodies in blankets, carried them up to the Reich Chancellery garden, placed them in a shell crater, poured gasoline over them, and set them on fire while Soviet shelling continued nearby. Soviet forces later recovered burned remains from the site. Identification was conducted through dental records, and subsequent historical research has supported the conclusion that Hitler died in the bunker on April 30th. Despite this, alternative escape theories circulated for decades, though no credible evidence has substantiated them. Hitler's death marked the effective end of Nazi leadership in Berlin. Within days, Germany would surrender unconditionally, bringing the war in Europe to a close. Benito Mussolini had ruled Italy as its fascist dictator for more than 2 decades. As the founder of fascism and head of government from 1922, he built a one-party state based on repression, propaganda, and expansionist ambitions. During World War II, he aligned Italy with Nazi Germany, a decision that ultimately led to military collapse and internal revolt. By April 1945, Mussolini was no longer in power. Allied advances and partisan uprisings had dismantled his regime, and northern Italy was falling apart. Attempting to avoid capture, Mussolini fled toward the Swiss border alongside his companion Clara Petacci, traveling within a German military convoy while wearing a disguise. On April 27th, near Lake Como, Italian communist partisans stopped the convoy at a checkpoint. Mussolini was recognized, removed from the column, and taken into custody. He and Petacci were held overnight while local resistance leaders decided their fate. The following day, April 28th, they were transported to the village of Giulino di Mezzigra. There, they were executed by gunfire under orders issued by partisan command. The precise details of the shooting and the identity of the executioner have been debated in historical accounts, but the outcome is not disputed. Mussolini was dead at age 61. Their bodies were then loaded onto a truck and taken to Milan. At Piazza Le Loreto, the corpses were dumped in public view. A crowd gathered quickly, and violence toward the bodies followed. Shortly afterward, Mussolini, Petacci, and several other executed fascist officials were hung upside down from a metal structure at a nearby service station. Images of the display circulated globally and became one of the defining visual conclusions to fascist rule in Italy. Mussolini's death came just days before the end of the war in Europe, closing the chapter on a regime that had once reshaped Italian political life and drawn the country into global conflict. When the war ended, Hideki Tojo didn't die in battle or disappear into exile. His final chapter unfolded inside a courtroom. Following Japan's surrender in 1945, Allied authorities moved quickly to arrest senior wartime leaders. Tojo, who had served as prime minister during Japan's expansion across Asia and the Pacific, became one of the primary figures held responsible for directing the country's military government during the conflict. On September 11, 1945, as U.S. forces arrived at his home to detain him, Tojo attempted suicide. He shot himself in the chest with a pistol. The wound was severe but not fatal. He survived after medical treatment and was placed into custody. Tojo was transferred to Tokyo and tried before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Proceedings lasted more than 2 years. Prosecutors presented evidence tying him to decisions surrounding aggressive war planning and military conduct across the region. He was ultimately convicted on multiple counts. On December 23, 1948, Tojo was executed by hanging at Sugamo prison. He was 64 years old. Afterward, his body was cremated. The remains were handled in a way intended to prevent the creation of any symbolic burial site, with portions scattered and others interred privately. His death concluded one of the highest-profile prosecutions connected to the post-war tribunals in Asia. For hours, nothing moved behind the closed door. Inside his residence outside Moscow, Joseph Stalin lay collapsed on the floor, unseen and unattended. The man who had ruled the Soviet Union through decades of purges, repression, and centralized authority was suddenly silent, and the silence itself became part of the event. On the night of March 1, 1953, Stalin had spent the evening drinking and meeting with members of his inner circle at his dacha. After dismissing those present, he withdrew to his private quarters. By the next morning, he had not emerged. Guards and staff noticed the break in pattern. Lights remained on, movement absent, no summons issued. Intervening without instruction was not routine behavior. Entering uninvited could carry severe consequences in the system Stalin himself had built. Hours passed before anyone acted. When personnel finally entered late that day, they found him on the floor, conscious, but incapacitated. He had suffered a major stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to communicate. Medical assistance was called, but the delay meant treatment began long after the initial collapse. Over the following days, he drifted in and out of awareness while senior officials monitored both his condition and the political implications of his potential death. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died at the age of 74. The official cause was a cerebral hemorrhage. The delay in discovering him has remained a subject of historical debate. Some interpretations attribute it entirely to fear among staff conditioned by decades of repression. Others have suggested the possibility of intentional hesitation or internal political calculation. No conclusive evidence has resolved the question, and the stroke remains the accepted explanation for his death. By the mid-70s, Mao Zedong was no longer appearing in public with the same frequency. His health had been deteriorating for years, and leadership responsibilities were increasingly handled by those around him while he remained at the center of the political structure he had built. Mao had led the Chinese Communist Party to victory in 1949 and ruled the country for decades, overseeing campaigns that reshaped Chinese society through mass mobilization, political purges, and economic experiments that carried enormous human cost. By 1976, however, the focus inside the government had shifted toward managing succession and stability. Throughout that year, Mao suffered multiple serious medical episodes, including heart and respiratory complications. In early September, his condition worsened significantly following another major cardiac event. He remained under constant medical supervision in Beijing as senior officials monitored both his health and the political consequences of his decline. On September 9, 1976, Mao Zedong died at the age of 82. Official announcements followed after internal coordination among party leadership, and the state organized an extended period of mourning across the country. His body was preserved and placed on public display in Beijing, where it remains. His death marked the end of a defining political era in modern Chinese history and immediately triggered internal shifts that would reshape the country's direction in the years that followed. Gunfire ended Rafael Trujillo's rule before any official transition could take place. For more than 3 decades, Trujillo had controlled the Dominican Republic through an authoritarian system built on surveillance, repression, and loyalty networks inside the military. His government ordered assassinations, silenced opposition, and maintained personal dominance over national institutions. By 1961, opposition had grown both domestically and internationally. Elements within the Dominican military began coordinating a plot to remove him, and declassified material later showed that U.S. intelligence agencies were aware of and had provided limited support to individuals involved in the conspiracy. On the night of May 30th, 1961, Trujillo was traveling by car along a highway outside Santo Domingo. Vehicles carrying the conspirators intercepted him. The attackers opened fire, striking the car repeatedly. Accounts differ on whether Trujillo attempted to return fire, but the result is consistent across sources. He was killed during the ambush at age 69. His body was removed from the scene, and the immediate aftermath unfolded in uncertainty among the plotters. Government loyalists quickly initiated retaliation once the assassination became known. Several conspirators were captured and executed, while others managed to escape. Trujillo's death ended one of the longest personalist dictatorships in the region and set off a turbulent transition period within the country's political system. Just days before his execution, Nicolae Ceaușescu still expected public support. On December 21, 1989, he delivered a speech from a balcony in Bucharest intended to reinforce authority as unrest spread across Romania. Such appearances were normally controlled demonstrations of loyalty. This time, parts of the crowd began shouting and disrupting the address. The reaction was broadcast live, and the visible hesitation marked a clear shift in momentum against his leadership. Ceaușescu had governed Romania since 1965, maintaining an authoritarian system centered on internal surveillance and political repression. As protests expanded nationwide, control deteriorated quickly. On December 22nd, he and his wife Elena fled the capital by helicopter as demonstrators entered government buildings. The aircraft was forced to land outside Bucharest, and the couple were detained by military forces shortly afterward. On December 25th, they were brought before a military tribunal at a base in Târgoviște. The proceedings were brief and conducted under revolutionary authority. Charges focused on abuse of power and responsibility for deaths during the crackdown on protests. A death sentence was issued the same day. Immediately after the verdict, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were taken into a courtyard and executed by firing squad. Footage confirming their deaths was broadcast on Romanian television shortly afterward, providing public confirmation that the leadership transition had been completed. By the time Saddam Hussein faced execution, he had already spent years in captivity following the collapse of his government. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq, he was located and captured by U.S. forces near Tikrit in December of that year. Images of his arrest circulated globally, showing the former president in detention and marking the definitive end of his rule. He was transferred to Iraqi custody and brought before the Iraqi Special Tribunal to face charges related to state violence carried out during his time in power. The case that led to his sentence focused on the events in the town of Dujail in 1982, where civilians were killed following an assassination attempt against him. The trial lasted months and involved witness testimony, documentation, and legal arguments over responsibility and jurisdiction. In November 2006, the court delivered its verdict, sentencing Saddam Hussein to death by hanging. In the early hours of December 30th, 2006, he was transported to an execution chamber in Baghdad. Officials present documented the procedure according to protocol. At the same time, an unauthorized recording captured interactions inside the room, including verbal taunts and sectarian remarks directed toward him before the execution began. Saddam remained composed throughout the process. The noose was secured, final procedures were completed, and the mechanism was activated. Death followed within moments. He was 69 years old. The unofficial video spread rapidly online and sparked international debate about the conduct and presentation of the execution. His body was later released to relatives and buried in his hometown near Tikrit. For months, Muammar Gaddafi had been on the run. After ruling Libya for more than 4 decades following his 1969 coup, his authority collapsed during the 2011 uprising that escalated into a full civil war. Government forces lost control of major cities, NATO-backed strikes targeted military positions, and loyalist territory shrank steadily through the summer. By the fall, Gaddafi had withdrawn towards Sirte, one of the last remaining strongholds under his influence. On October 20th, 2011, A convoy attempting to leave the city was struck by air attacks that disabled multiple vehicles and scattered those inside. Survivors fled the wreckage on foot. Gaddafi and a small group of guards moved into a nearby drainage area while opposition fighters searched the zone. He was discovered shortly afterward. Video recorded by fighters on the scene shows him injured, disoriented, and taken into custody. He had visible wounds and was surrounded by armed captors. The footage captures chaotic handling as he was moved from the site. What happened next has been examined extensively and remains disputed in detail. Medical reports confirmed he died from gunshot wounds sustained shortly after capture. Accounts differ on whether the fatal injuries occurred during crossfire or after he had already been detained. Investigations by international organizations later concluded there was evidence suggesting he may have been killed after capture, but the exact sequence of events has never been definitively reconstructed. Gaddafi was 69 years old. His body was transported to Misrata, where it was placed in refrigerated storage and publicly viewed for several days. Images circulated worldwide before burial took place at an undisclosed desert location. The site was intentionally kept secret to prevent it from becoming a symbolic destination. His death marked the end of centralized rule in Libya, but it did not conclude the conflict, which fragmented into competing factions in the years that followed. Francisco Franco's death unfolded slowly and under close state management. After leading Spain since the end of the Civil War in 1939, he remained head of state into his 80s. By the early 1970s, his physical condition had begun to deteriorate significantly. Responsibilities were increasingly delegated while political leadership quietly prepared for transition under the framework he had established. In October 1975, Franco suffered a series of serious health crises. He experienced circulatory complications and internal bleeding that required repeated hospital interventions in Madrid. Multiple surgical procedures were performed as doctors attempted to stabilize him. His condition fluctuated, at times appearing briefly stable before declining again. As the medical situation worsened, governmental authority was temporarily transferred to Prince Juan Carlos, in accordance with existing provisions, ensuring continuity while Franco remained hospitalized. Updates on his health were closely managed and communicated through official channels. Over several weeks, Franco experienced organ failure linked to his deteriorating cardiovascular condition. On November 20th, 1975, he died at age 82. The official cause was heart failure following the extended medical decline. State mourning ceremonies followed, conducted with full institutional protocol. Within days, Juan Carlos formally assumed the role of head of state, beginning a political transition that would ultimately move Spain away from authoritarian rule. Franco's passing was not sudden or violent. It occurred within a controlled medical environment after prolonged deterioration, concluding one of the longest continuous personal leadership periods in modern European politics. Here's how 10 infamous dictators met their end. Each story unfolded differently, but all led to the same outcome. Which case stood out to you the most or surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, boost it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you soon for more dark stories.